next Sunday, we begin a journey through the Old Testament book of Esther, and what I think is one of the more fascinating books in the entire Bible. And I hope you're able to be here for many of those sermons. And of course, you can always catch them on YouTube, because God has important things to say to us through the book of Esther. I think probably the best known verse in that book is chapter 4, verse 14. I hear this quoted sometimes, where Mordecai says to Esther, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." It's going to be some weeks before we explore that passage and focus on the choice Esther has to make and the lessons the Lord has for us in that text. Today, however, I want to focus on just that last phrase, "for such a time as this." Because I believe each of us needs to consider what that means for our lives. I believe not just Esther, but every single one of us exists in a particular time and place for a particular reason. You exist at this time and are here today for a reason. That's the clear implication of what the Bible teaches. Ephesians 1:11, for example, tells us that God is the one who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Every detail of our lives is under the umbrella of his sovereignty. That's true for individuals, and that's true for even nations. Acts 17:26, "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods of time and the boundaries of their dwelling place." Every day, each of you has multiple opportunities to make choices that are pleasing to the Lord, opportunities to do his will. As a song by Wayne Watson says, "For such a time as this, I was placed upon the earth to hear the voice of God and do his will, whatever it is." And friend, that's your assignment each and every day. Now, sometimes your assignments will seem very weighty, very significant. The choice that you face will seem like it's going to either impact your life in a huge way, or it will affect many different people. Maybe this week, for example, you're working on a cure for cancer, and this will be the week where you have that breakthrough. Yet, that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, our choices seem rather ordinary, mundane, insignificant. And yet, every time you choose to do the will of God, whatever it is, that matters. It matters in ways that you might not even imagine. The ripple effects of your choices may extend far beyond your wildest dreams. Benjamin Franklin, 4th of July, we mentioned one of our founders. He noted, "For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For a want of the horse, the rider was lost. For the want of a rider, the battle was lost. For the want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for the want of a horseshoe nail." Well, Ben Franklin's a good example of ripple effects. The choices that he and others made 246 years ago in Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, July 3rd and 4th, 1776. Those are indescribable ripple effects that came from that convocation. Now, again, don't miss the point. I'm not suggesting any of us will make choices like that this week. In fact, the reality is, in the vast majority of cases, the loss of one horseshoe nail changes nothing. But not always. Not always. Every once in a while, a very little event can have a huge significance. And my point is that it's impossible for us to know the ripple effects of many of our choices. God alone knows the impacts they will have. And his promises, if you make the right choices, if you make choices according to his will, they will be used for God's glory, and they'll be used for our ultimate good. So, our choices matter in ways that we don't recognize. So the question is, what choices do you need to be making? What choices do you need to make for such a time as this? Frankly, I can't answer that question for you. Each of you has the responsibility to search the scriptures, to study the Bible, to learn what God says, and then prayerfully ponder how to apply it in specific situations that you face in your life. However, as your pastor, it is my job to help you understand what God does say in his word, and I also want to help you think about how God's word applies to our world in the time in which we live, for such a time as this. I pray often that God will give me wisdom so that I might be like the men from the tribe of Issachar, 1 Chronicles 12, who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. And so after decades of studying the Bible and after quite a bit of prayerful pondering, here are some things I believe God is calling really all Christians, including every one of you in this room who's a believer in Jesus. This is what he's calling you to do at such a time as this. The first thing is avoid sin that will discredit the gospel. I could say just avoid sin, and if you did that, that would be wonderful, but specifically avoid those sins that are going to discredit the gospel. You know, an important part of the physician's Hippocratic oath is do no harm. Do whatever you can do, but make sure you don't do any harm. And I would say that is a good goal for us as well. Do not do things that are going to harm your testimony of faith. Don't do things that will harm the reputation of Jesus Christ in our community. Don't do things that will cause people to have a negative attitude toward Christianity. Excuse me. That's one of the goals the Apostle Paul had, 2 Corinthians 6:3. He says, we put no stumbling block in anyone's path so that our ministry will not be discredited. He did not want to do anything that would cause people to think so that the gospel would be discredited, that people would not consider the message he was proclaiming. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I'm thinking about the recent sexual abuse and cover-up scandal in the Southern Baptist Convention. There are many dimensions to that story. My point is simply this. When people learn that a church leader has abused a child, or when it comes out that a pastor knew another pastor had assaulted a woman but did nothing about that, when that happens, the gospel, Christianity, will almost always be blamed or faulted in some way. Those type of sins cause the gospel to be discredited. Now, to be clear, our sin never makes the gospel any less true. For example, it's a horrible thought, but let's say the pastors and the deacons in this church got involved in some horrible, illegal activity of some type. If that occurred, everything we said about Jesus and about his death, about his resurrection, about the salvation found in him, all those things would still be true. Even if all the pastors and deacons were sitting in jail, everything we said about the gospel would still be true. Our sin would not change that fact at all. Yet our sin would almost certainly stand in the way of folks seeing that truth. Oh yeah, it would be the evil one who would use those things to blind people to the gospel, but he would be using our evil. He'd be using our evil for which we're responsible to do that. And that's true whether our evil involves sexual sin or dishonesty or racism or anger or addiction or selfishness or all sorts of other sins. Yes, your sin will certainly damage your own soul. But my point is, it can also discredit the gospel, and it can damage the souls of many, many others. Now, yeah, there's many false and exaggerated accusations being made against Christians in churches today. That's not right. It's not fair. And oftentimes, yeah, we should speak up and should clarify what has actually happened or what's happening. However, I think we're also learning that when there is some truth to an accusation, even a little truth, the best thing to do is not try to hide it, but acknowledge it, to deal with it, and seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Oh, it's better if by God's grace you avoid the actions and words and attitudes that discredit the gospel. But whenever we fail, as we all do at times, it's important to own that and remind others that, no, I don't claim to be perfect. I claim to be a sinner that's saved by grace. For such a time as this, avoid those sins that will discredit the gospel. Secondly, for such a time as this, the Lord is calling us to be people who speak the truth with boldness, wisdom, and love. That's my little triad this morning. Boldness, wisdom, and love. Now, some of you thinking, Pastor Dan, I'm an ordinary person. I'm not a pastor. I don't even teach first grade Sunday school class. That's just not me. Well, that may be true, but I do believe that you and every other Christian, that you are called to be Christ's ambassadors. I believe that because that's what 2 Corinthians 5:20 tells us, where Paul says, therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. And I'm convinced Paul is not just describing his own ministry, but that it is God's desire, it is his will that every Christian be an ambassador of Jesus Christ, and that we seek to be effective as ambassadors representing the Lord in a way that would truly bring honor to him. And I suggest that speaking the truth with boldness, wisdom, and love is a big part of being an effective ambassador for Christ. But I'm not a public speaker, Pastor Dan. I'm not going to be up front talking to everyone. I'm not going to stand on the street corner and preach or anything like that. Well, maybe not again. And yet, you all, have the opportunities to speak the truth. And you never know how the Lord might use your words to accomplish his purposes. You don't know what those ripple effects will be. You can speak truth to someone, and you never know how God might use that. Here's some examples. It might be a conversation with your grandson. He asks, Grandpa, do you think evolution and the Bible can both be true? Or Grandma, aren't all religions basically the same, telling us to be good people? Or maybe you're talking with your daughter about the best way to parent a troubled child, and your advice to your daughter helps her to be a wonderful parent, and that troubled child grows up to be the next Billy Graham, and it's all because of that little advice you gave her that one day. It might be what you say during a discussion about same-sex marriage in sociology class at college. It could be what you're discussing with other students at school about using alcohol and drugs. Could be a conversation you're having with your sister about why her marriage seems to be falling apart. It could be a discussion with coworkers about why there's so much violence in our society these days, or about what racial justice really means, or about why freedom of religion is such an important right. Those are just examples, to me, illustrating that I suspect almost every one of you will have the opportunity to speak the truth, God's truth, biblical truth, to someone in the week ahead. Every one of you will have some opportunity to speak God's truth to another person in the week ahead. And friend, you need to do that. And you need to do it with boldness, with wisdom, and with love. And yes, first of all, an effective ambassador of Jesus needs to speak the truth with boldness. Now, most of us like to be liked by other people. And so we sometimes keep our mouths shut when we should be speaking. Now, it's also true that sometimes wisdom tells us to keep our mouths shut when we would like to be speaking, and wisdom says, no, you just keep your mouth shut about that. But anyway, many times we are tempted to be silent when the Lord wants us to speak. Don't ever be afraid to disagree with someone or to express a thought not shared by others if you believe it is truth that the Lord wants you to share. Don't ever be afraid to say it just because someone else might disagree. 2 Timothy 1:7, for God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control, a spirit that enables us to speak the truth with boldness. For such a time as this, we need the courage to focus not on what other people think about us, but on how we can speak words that glorify God and can help people experience His grace. Now, for many of us, the place to start is to pray. Pray, Lord, please help me to have the courage to be bold in speaking the truth. In Ephesians 6:19, the Apostle Paul says, dear friends, pray for me that I could be bold in preaching the truth. And if Paul asked his friends to do that, we should certainly ask our friends to do that. Please pray for me that I would be bold to speak the truth. And yet, to be an effective ambassador of Jesus, especially during this time, we need more than boldness. Number two, we also need to speak the truth with wisdom. We need God's Spirit to fill us with wisdom that will permeate all that we say. That involves many, many different things, and I'm just going to mention two of them that I think are important for such a time as this. Number one, when we speak, we need to avoid exaggerations or false statements. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we must be committed to the truth. And in a world which is full of so many different opinions, with so many people spinning and twisting the facts, we need to make sure the things we say are indeed true. Now, Christians haven't always done that. Sometimes we've been gullible and we've blindly trusted people who simply are not trustworthy. Other times we might believe something simply because we would like it to be true, which is not a smart thing to do. For example, I remember this is for many years, even before there was an internet, there were reports circulating throughout evangelical churches claiming that the well-known atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair had filed a motion with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to ban all Christian broadcasting on radio and television, that she'd filed this motion. And so I remember seeing people passing around petitions urging the FCC to reject O'Hair's motion. I maybe even signed a couple of those petitions. Some of those petitions were submitted with thousands of signatures. The only problem was the FCC was not even considering a motion to eliminate religious broadcasting. They weren't doing so because neither Madalyn Murray O'Hair or anyone else had at least formally made such a request. And when I saw a petition being circulated in a church, not this one, I saw a petition being circulated 10 years after Madalyn Murray O'Hair had died, saying she's proposing that religious broadcasting be banned. I realized that not only can a lie travel faster than the truth, it can also have a fairly long lifespan. Folks, whenever we as Christians believe and repeat hoaxes, we undermine our credibility and we discredit the gospel. So wisdom demands avoid exaggerations, avoid false statements. Make sure when you're speaking what is true. Secondly, wisdom demands that we focus on the gospel. Listen carefully, because this can be kind of tricky and sticky maybe. Because of what God has revealed to us through the Bible, I have opinions on a wide variety of current issues in our society. For example, I believe abortion is a horrific practice. I'm totally opposed to encouraging transgenderism in children. I don't want Darwinian evolution to be taught as a fact in our schools. I don't believe same-sex marriage is ordained by God. I think we're called to be good stewards of our environment, but we must never worship nature. I'm convinced the exercise of religious freedom is really our most important right. I believe critical race theory is incompatible with biblical justice and will likely create more racial division and animosity, not less. And I could make the list longer. These are not just random opinions I have. I have random opinions too, but these are views I believe are rooted in what the Bible teaches. And thus I think they are views that others should share, and I think they're important issues to discuss. However, none of these opinions, nor all of them put together, are nearly as important as my belief that Jesus Christ is the eternal Son of God who died on the cross for my sins and rose from the dead to guarantee my salvation. None of those opinions, or all of them put together, are nearly as important as what I believe about Jesus Christ. And friend, if you have different opinions on issues than I do, or if you have opinions on different issues that you think are important, none of those opinions are as important as what you as a Christian believe about Jesus Christ. Don't forget that. And that means when I when people think about me or talk about me, oh, Pastor Dan, I don't want them thinking, oh, yeah, he has some pretty conservative political opinions. I don't want them to think that. Remember that. I don't even want them to think, oh, Pastor Dan, the Packer fan, that's him. No, I want them to think, oh, yeah, he's the one who believes in and follows Jesus and who is constantly talking about that salvation is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. For such a time as this, wisdom demands that we make and keep the gospel of Jesus Christ the focus of our individual lives and the focus of our church. We are about Jesus Christ. Thirdly, to be effective ambassadors of Jesus, we need to speak the truth with love. We need to care about the people to whom we're talking. And we need to communicate in such a way that they know that we care about them. Paul puts it this way, Ephesians 4:15, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Now, this does not mean that we should never speak firmly. Good parents, good political ambassadors know it's sometimes necessary to do that. But our firm words should always be packaged and permeated with love. Back in 1984, Frankie Schaeffer wrote this book called A Time for Anger. And there are some very good things in this book. Schaeffer does a nice job of explaining how Christians must not be ambivalent or neutral toward the evil around us. There are things happening out there that should make us angry. And yet what Schaeffer failed to clarify was that our anger is really not to be directed against the people who are believing, saying, or doing those wrong things. Oh, they may seem like our enemies, but remember, Jesus says we're to love those enemies. And ultimately, our goal is to urge those people, those seeming enemies, to urge them, to persuade them, to help them escape from the kingdom of darkness and join us in the kingdom of light. In other words, we want those people to become Christians, to become believers in and followers of Jesus. Now, Pastor Dan, wasn't Jesus angry at the money changers he threw out of the temple? Wasn't he angry at the Pharisees sometimes? Yes, he was. And it may indeed be appropriate to be angry at religious leaders and teachers who are leading people astray. And yet I would warn you that most of us have a difficult time replicating Jesus' righteous anger. He was angry without sinning. Most of us, when we get angry, tend to fall into sin as well. For such a time as this, I think we need to focus on understanding and practicing the instructions the Lord gives us through Paul in 2 Timothy 2:24 through 26. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness, so that God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and that they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. There's people like that in your neighborhood. There's people like that you work with, people like that in your family. They have been captured by the devil. And our goal is to not let them stay in the kingdom of darkness, but to help them, to encourage them, leave the kingdom of darkness, join us in the kingdom of light. And yeah, ultimately it is God who enables people to do that. But at such a time as this, he desires to use us, to use our words, our actions, to accomplish his purpose. And as we seek to determine the best way to do that, I suggest a far better model than Frankie Schaeffer in his time for anger would be his father, Francis Schaeffer, who passed away in 1984, and who always demonstrated compassion toward folks who opposed him, but folks he knew had been captured by the devil to do his will. And while son Frankie is now a rather confused man, describing himself as a Christian atheist right now, his father's legacy is always one of speaking the truth with boldness, with wisdom, and with love. For such a time as this, I'm convinced we need to follow that model.